Hi everybody, thank you for joining me once again as I continue to examine Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict from my atheist perspective. In this video, we will begin covering part 4 of the book, Truth or Consequences, and we will be covering chapters 32 through 34, beginning with chapter 32, The Nature of Truth. Yes, we will be beginning part 4 of the book, and the best part about part 4 of Evidence That Demands a Verdict is that there is no part 5. There are only 4 parts. We're almost done. So, chapter 32, The Nature of Truth. Right before this chapter, there is a personal note from the author in which Josh McDowell explains why he has included this coming section of the book, material on the nature of truth. The reason is to counter responses to Christianity such as, that may be true for you, but that's not true for me. By establishing that truth is not a relative thing, McDowell intends to strengthen his case for the unique truth of Christianity. And he says, quote, "Some readers who are very philosophical in thinking may feel these chapters are either challenging or may conclude that my treatment of various critical issues is rather unsophisticated. Some may complain that the material is too complicated or hard to understand, while others may feel that the material is too simplistic and not conclusive enough on each issue." In other words, what is true about these next several chapters for some readers may not be true for others. Got it. So, on to the chapter. McDowell spends most of it summarizing what is commonly referred to as the correspondence theory of truth. And he cites Aristotle, he cites Thomas Aquinas, Bertrand Russell, and other philosophers, all of whom generally agree that there is a world independent of our minds, and our beliefs about that world are true if they describe the actual state of affairs in that world. If our beliefs correspond with reality, then they are true. And if our beliefs don't correspond with reality, then we must consider them to be false. That's the correspondence theory of truth. McDowell goes on to describe some of the pitfalls of a relativist theory of truth, sort of like the "it might be true for you, but it's not true for me" sort of thing. Some of those pitfalls are that it denies the law of non-contradiction, it's incoherent since it requires at least some absolute truth to exist, because truth is either relative or it's not, and so on. Now, I don't have a problem with this, by the way. My own concept of truth is much like McDowell's, generally speaking. Beliefs about the world beyond our minds are either true or false most of the time, and two contradictory beliefs cannot be true in the same sense at the same time. This is true of our everyday, usual human experience. And personally, if I were in an argument with someone and they resorted to denying the existence of truth, I would feel that I had won the argument. McDowell moves on from arguing for absolute truth to arguing for absolute morality, as he attacks the concept of moral relativism. Moral relativism, McDowell tells us, through a quotation from J.P. Moreland, implies that moral propositions are neither absolutely true nor absolutely false, but rather depend on their context and the moral standards that are being appealed to when making moral propositions or making moral judgments. Still citing Moreland, McDowell lists 5 consequences of moral relativism. Consequence number 1, it complicates the process of determining the rightness or wrongness of a given action if the involved parties come from different societies with different moral standards. How do you decide who is right and who is wrong? 2, it complicates the process of determining rightness or wrongness of actions if the involved party is simultaneously a member of multiple societies with different conflicting moral standards. For example, if you were born in society A, but you live in society B, and you do something that is acceptable in society A, but unacceptable in society B, is your act acceptable or unacceptable? How do you determine which standard to apply? 3, it makes moral reform impossible because any moral reformer would by definition be wrong because he or she would stand in opposition to the morals of his or her society. 4 certain acts are wrong regardless of social convention. For instance, torturing babies. Doesn't matter what the standards of morality of your particular society are. Torturing babies is always wrong according to this consequence. And number 5, it makes it impossible for one society to criticize another society for immoral behavior. So let's have a look at these 5 consequences. The first thing I notice about them is that none of them have any bearing on whether morality actually is relative or not. They are basically 5 different faces of an appeal to consequences. If morality is relative, then this happens and that's bad. Well, okay. Maybe it's bad, maybe it's not. That depends on your own personal judgment. But whether a proposition brings with it undesirable consequences is irrelevant to whether that proposition is true. It's possible that all 5 of those consequences could result from a relative morality, and that all 5 of them could be very undesirable, and morality would still be a relative thing, whether we like it or not. The consequences have no bearing on whether or not it's actually true or not. And as it happens, morality is relative, or I would rather say morality is subjective. And those 5 consequences McDowell and Moreland list aren't quite as horrible as they're meant to sound. And by the way, when I say that morality is relative or morality is subjective, I'm not making that judgment because I want morality to be subjective. I mean, I happen to think morality only works when it is subjective. I think the idea of absolute morality or objective morality is kind of meaningless. But that's not why I say that. I say that morality is subjective because that's what I observe. When you look at the world, when you look at how moral principles are thought about and spoken about and applied, it's clear to me that morality is a subjective thing. And it's puzzling to me how any honest, observant person can think that anything else is possibly the case. When you look at human societies, when you look at human behavior, morality is obviously a subjective thing. It's obviously something that we have created for ourselves as a tool for us to use. It wasn't something that was bestowed upon us by some other source. My response to the first 2 of these 5 consequences, that subjective morality makes it more difficult to determine whether a given action is right or wrong, is, well, so what? I mean, it is what it is. We're back to that appeal to consequences. The flaw in McDowell's absolutist view of morality that reveals it to be false, not to mention simplistic and useless, is that it posits morality as a simple thing, and it's just not. Morality is complicated. Morality at times is incredibly complicated. It isn't always black and white. In fact, if we take a few steps back and look at the whole of human experience and all the moral decisions, large and small, that we are asked to make over the course of a lifetime, all the interests we have to balance, all the responsibilities we have to bear in mind as we make these judgments, we see that it's hardly ever black and white. Often it's not obvious whether we should praise, condemn, or passively tolerate a given action. Often we have to grapple with difficult moral decisions. Often it's not clear what the right thing is, and sometimes it's never clear what the right thing is, even after much struggle and deliberation. And guess what? That is fucking life. A child might wish that it were simpler, that there was a list of do's and don'ts handed down from on high for us to follow, but that does not seem to be our situation. The third consequence McDowell and Moreland list is that relativism renders moral reform impossible. But to consider that a consequence of relative subjective morality, McDowell and Moreland have to misunderstand both how subjective morality works and how absolute objective morality would work if there were such a thing, and that is no easy feat. First, they misunderstand subjective morality by simplifying it. How can a reformer improve the morals of his society, they ask, if he has already demonstrated himself to be wrong by opposing the morals of his society? Well, simple. Subjective morality is not rigid. McDowell and Moreland describe it as though every society has its own morality, and each society's morality is set in stone and forever unchanging. But what subjective morality actually means is that moral standards can evolve and change over time. Yes, moral standards can differ from place to place, community to community, but they can also differ within communities. And the moral consensus of a community can change. And sometimes that change can be driven by reformers. In fact, moral reform can only occur within such a society. This is where the misunderstanding of absolute morality comes in. A society that views its present moral standards as absolutely true is not very susceptible to reform. The fourth consequence, that some things are just wrong regardless of the moral consensus of one society, is essentially the same as William Lane Craig's childish moral argument, which you've heard him state in much how I'm going to state it in a few seconds. If you've ever seen him in a debate, it's a part of his usual shtick, and it has been for years. It goes like this: if there were no God, then absolute moral standards would not exist, but absolute moral standards do exist. Well, says who? What are these absolute moral standards? How do you know them? If someone holds to a conflicting standard that he also believes to be absolute, how do we determine whose moral standard is the true one? Even something as easy as torturing babies is wrong is ultimately just a matter of opinion. It's a very, very widely held opinion, but it's still an opinion. And you might not like that. You might wish that there were some absolute, transcendent moral standard, completely independent of human thought, that defined baby torture as absolutely wrong. But I see no evidence of that standard or of any other absolute moral standard. We're on our own here. We have to make our own moral judgments as individuals, as families, as communities, as civilizations, and ever increasingly as a species. If torturing babies is wrong, and I kind of think it is, then it's wrong because we have decided that it was wrong. And that requirement that we participate in our morality, that we engage with moral questions and argue with each other and determine for ourselves whether something is right or wrong, I consider that a strength, not a weakness. I think our morals would be absolutely worthless without it. The fifth consequence, that relativism makes it impossible to criticize other societies on moral grounds, again misunderstands what relativism or subjectivism means. Acknowledging that morality is a subjective matter doesn't require us to endorse every moral standard held by every other group. And to illustrate this, let's appeal to Hitler, shall we? Let's pretend that it's the 1940s. I can acknowledge that when I say something like it's wrong for Hitler to murder Jews in the Holocaust, I'm making a subjective statement. I can acknowledge that according to the moral code Hitler recognizes, it is not wrong to murder Jews in the Holocaust. But that doesn't mean that I have to endorse or even tolerate Hitler's murdering of Jews in the Holocaust. Why? Because I didn't just arbitrarily decide that murdering Jews, or anyone else for that matter, is wrong. I have good reasons for thinking that. And I have good reasons for thinking that what Hitler is doing is wrong. Is it just my opinion? Well, in a sense, yes. Does Hitler have a different opinion? Yes, apparently Hitler does have quite a different opinion. Does that mean I'm helpless morally? Does that mean that I'm not allowed to intervene to stop Hitler from murdering Jews in the Holocaust? No, quite the opposite. In fact, it means that I acknowledge the difference between my moral code and that of Hitler, but it doesn't mean that I'm bound to act according to Hitler's moral code. I'm bound to act according to my moral code. And my moral code compels me to intervene to stop Hitler from murdering Jews in the Holocaust. It's not required that killing Jews be absolutely, objectively, transcendently wrong in order for me to intervene. All that's necessary is that the moral code that I recognize tell me that it's wrong and should be stopped. No absolute morality is necessary. Moving on now to chapter 33, the knowability of truth. Having defined truth as that which corresponds with reality in chapter 32, McDowell announces that chapter 33 will be devoted to demonstrating that we can know things about reality, and therefore that we can know whether our beliefs about reality are true. And McDowell begins by discussing first principles. These are the basic assumptions underlying knowledge. They are the starting points of reason. And first principles include identity. A thing is identical to itself, otherwise it would not be itself. Non-contradiction. Contradictory statements cannot be simultaneously true. The excluded middle. A proposition is either true or false. There is no middle ground. Causality. Every proposition that is not a first principle depends for its truth on another proposition and then ultimately on the self-evident propositions of the first principles. And finality. Propositions communicate some meaning. Agents act towards some end. These first principles can all be reduced ultimately to the principle of non-contradiction, which McDowell, with assistance from Norman Geisler and Mortimer Adler, whom he quotes, defines as the axiom that underlies all of reality. A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time. And we can be certain that first principles are true because their truth is self-evident. As soon as we understand the terms being used to talk about these principles, we can see that they must be true. A thing cannot simultaneously be itself and something other than itself. We don't need to demonstrate this, we can simply perceive that it is true, and that's what makes it a first principle. Now, McDowell and I don't disagree too much on this stuff. I don't feel the need to resort to denying the existence of truth or denying our ability to know things about reality or propose that all truth is relative and what might be true for you might not be true for me or any of that to justify my atheism, to justify my non-Christianity. I don't say that Christianity is false for me. I say Christianity is false, full stop. And no other atheist I'm acquainted with feels the need to appeal to these sorts of arguments either. Most atheists that I am acquainted with and even familiar with don't appeal to the relativist theory of truth. They're perfectly comfortable working within a correspondence theory of truth and still finding ample reasons to reject Christianity and to reject belief in God. But there is one thing that McDowell says in his defense of first principles that I feel the need to comment on. McDowell says that first principles are natural knowledge, that we don't learn them from experience, but we are born with them already in our brains. And he refers to Norm Geisler and Thomas Aquinas, who also hold this opinion of first principles. Natural knowledge of first principles is ingrained in our nature, says Geisler, by God himself. I have a problem with this. Obviously, I don't think God gave us natural knowledge is a reasonable explanation for how we know first principles. My problem is that I don't see how there can be any such thing as natural knowledge. There are things such as instinct, such as sort of genetically determined patterns of behavior, but that's not knowledge. First principles refer to the world outside of our minds. First principles describe things, very, very basic things, but things nonetheless about the world, and I don't see how you get that information apart from interacting with the world. I don't see where natural knowledge can come from. To me, all knowledge of the external, all knowledge of everything that is outside of our minds must come from experience. It must be empirical. Even something as fundamental as the law of contradiction must originate from our experience. The first principles are like laws of logic. They tell us how we have to think if we want our thoughts to yield useful, reliable information about the world. But like the laws of physics, these laws are descriptive, not prescriptive. Just as the law of gravity doesn't determine how fast an object falls to Earth, but rather describes it, so too does the law of contradiction not determine that a thing cannot be itself and not itself at the same time, but rather describes that this is part of the nature of reality. And how do we know that this is the nature of reality? We experience it. We see that this is the case. Now, if even the first principles upon which we base all of our reasoning are derived ultimately from experience, doesn't that mean that reason itself is circular? Aren't we evaluating our experiences using reason that is itself based on our experiences? Well, I think the answer unavoidably is yes. And I also think that it does no good to pretend that things are otherwise by claiming that our starting point is not experience, but rather an imaginary ultimate source of truth like God. Reason itself may be circular, but it also seems to work when honestly and consistently applied. The trick then, as someone much wiser than me, whose name I have unfortunately forgotten, once said, is to make the circle as big as possible. And now we come to chapter 34, Answering Postmodernism. McDowell first summarizes what he calls the chief characteristics of postmodernism. These would be the rejection of the correspondence theory of truth, incredulity to meta-narratives, that is, rejection of grand stories that claim the ability to explain and account for reality, such as religion, but also theories of philosophy and science that attempt to explain why things are the way they are. Our inability to ever encounter the thing in itself, the denial of an ultimate foundation for knowledge or reality, regarding objectivity as illusory, and regarding truth as totally subjective. And McDowell then replies to these chief features of postmodernism, although he doesn't take on each of the chief characteristics specifically. Rather, he first chooses to employ what Norman Geisler and Frank Turek call the Roadrunner argument. Remember that? To assert that postmodernism itself is self-defeating. Postmodernists argue that it's true that there is no such thing as truth. That is a self-defeating statement. Well, did you miss the Roadrunner argument? Because I didn't. I am not a postmodernist, but that doesn't mean that I think it's fair to just dismiss the entire philosophy and all of the points it possibly has to make with a rhetorical trick like the Roadrunner argument. The truth is there is no such thing as truth may be a self-contradicting statement. It is a self-contradicting statement. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't refer to an actual state of affairs. Whenever we make use of language, we're dealing in constructs and symbols, some of which refer to things in reality. And pointing out that the language used to attempt to describe something about reality is self-defeating only points to the limitations of our language or our ability to use it. It doesn't prove that the something being referred to doesn't exist. It may be that the only absolute truth is that there is no such thing as absolute truth. That may in fact be the case. The fact that our language ties itself in knots attempting to describe the concept could only reflect the limitations of our language, not the impossibility of the concept, or rather the impossibility of the thing to which the concept refers. Confused? I am, but in an invigorating sort of way, so it's all good. Speaking of language and symbols and concepts and referring to things, McDowell next quibbles with the postmodern idea that we can never know the thing itself. Quoting extensively from Etienne Gilson, McDowell responds to this idea that we can never know the thing itself with his own argument, which I can summarize as follows. Can so? Seriously, that's pretty much the gist of it. Gilson's version is much more verbose and I would suggest deliberately abstruse, asserting things like the sense differs from the sensible, but the sense is not different from the object sensed. But all he's doing in the end is making an assertion of his own to counter the assertion that the thing itself can't be known. He doesn't even attempt to give us any reasons why he is right and those he is arguing against are wrong. He simply makes his own assertion and says, oh, that's not true, this is true. Now, as I said, I'm not a postmodernist, but this is one feature of postmodernism that I hold to very firmly, this idea that we cannot know the thing itself. And not for philosophical reasons at all, but for scientific ones. It's true that we can never know the thing itself because we are inescapably imprisoned by our senses. We are totally dependent on our senses and our brains for every single thing we know about the outside world, the world beyond our own minds. When you look at me right now, you're aware that you're not actually seeing me. You're seeing a video image of me. But even if we were in the same room and you were looking directly at me, you would still not be seeing me myself, but rather an image of me created by your brain based on sensory information gathered by your eyes. We don't actually experience the world. We experience our brain's interpretation of the world. And this is a fact. It's a fascinating and somewhat unsettling fact. And that's why I think a disorder like paranoid schizophrenia is so frightening and why most of us would rather not even contemplate what it's like to suffer from it. It's an extreme reminder that we are all completely at the mercy of our brains. Now, this doesn't mean that our senses are unreliable. Our experience tells us that most of the time, for most of us, our senses are reliable, and we can usually be assured that what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch is close enough to reality, to the things themselves, that we can disregard that separation between perception and reality for the purpose of our everyday lives. What it does mean is that we should be very, very careful when it comes to attaching certainty to our beliefs. Reasonable certainty, functional certainty, certainty beyond a reasonable doubt, reliable certainty, certainty sufficient to act upon. Sure, we can have that kind of certainty. And maybe if you don't like cluttering your inner monologue with qualifiers, you could call this sort of certainty confidence instead. We can have confidence in our senses, confidence in our reason and evidence-based beliefs, but we cannot have absolute certainty. And the main reason for denying ourselves absolute certainty is so that we don't become rigid and dogmatic in our beliefs. So we remain flexible and open enough to accept good evidence or good arguments that contradict our beliefs, no matter how confidently held. I think it's important that we don't go through life questioning everything we think and do constantly. We shouldn't go through life assuming that we're wrong. We could hardly function with a mindset like that. But I think it's important to always leave open the possibility, however unlikely, that we are wrong. We should be open and willing to change our minds if compelling evidence comes along. It should go without saying that if we can't have absolute certainty about the world we experience and interact with every day, we can have even less certainty about something like God, a being who is said to transcend even the most basic physical laws of our reality, and maybe some of the logical laws too. Anyone who speaks of God with anything even approaching absolute certainty is a fool. But of course, that's just my opinion, not an absolute truth. That is it for this video. That's it for chapter 34. In the next video, I will look at the next 3 chapters of the book. Chapter 35, Answering Skepticism. Chapter 36, Answering Agnosticism. And chapter 37, Answering Mysticism. That should be interesting. So, I will see you for the next video to take care of those 3 chapters. We're almost done. Only 2 videos left in the series. The next video and then one after that. And then that's it. We're through with this book. I can hardly wait. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please comment, argue with me, agree with me, engage with me, however you wish. I look forward to hearing from you, and I will see you in the next video.